Hello. Welcome to Study with Sudhir. I am TS Sudhir. Before we get started, do subscribe to Study with Sudhir and also press on the bell icon so that you can get regular updates every time we post a new video about a chapter, about a poem or any of our motivational videos. Today we are going to focus on Hearts and Hands by O. Henry. That is a chapter, that's a short story which is part of the class 9 and 10 ICSE board syllabus. It's a fascinating story. It's one of my favorite stories because it gives you a sense of different human emotions with just 3 characters, and that's really the beauty of O. Henry's short stories. I hope you have read some of his other stories just to get a sense of the kind of storytelling techniques that O. Henry has used in order to embellish his characters, make his characters look that much more interesting. In fact, his real name is William Sidney Potter. He was an American writer and he wrote under the pen name of O. Henry. Now, as I said, his short stories are known for the manner in which he would flesh out his characters. They are known for their humor, for their wit. And this particular story, Hearts and Hands, is actually set on a train. It's actually set on a train in the USA, and it talks about the exchange between 2 acquaintances. I wouldn't call them friends. They do not know each other too well, but they're essentially acquaintances. One is Miss Fairchild and the other is Mr. Easton. It has the exchange between the 2 on the train in the compartment, and the interesting part really comes right at the end, the twist at the end, and that's what makes the story that much very fascinating. So we would be looking at all the 3 characters as part of this story and also the themes in this particular story. So let's get started. As I always say, keep the book right in front of you as you get into this digital classroom and also this pencil, or you could keep your notebook and write down the notes with a pen. But that's very important. I would go very slowly. I would repeat some of the points, but at any time if you have any problem, pause the video, ensure that you write down the notes either on the book itself with a pencil or in a notebook with a pen. But do ensure that you have your notes ready, because that's how all these lessons in English literature are to be read, more importantly to be enjoyed and be understood very clearly. And then when you analyze it, you yourself will find it is such a fascinating and interesting journey. So let's get started. At Denver is a town in the USA. There was an influx of passengers into the coaches on the eastbound B&M Express. So which means that this train is starting from somewhere in the west coast and it's going towards the east coast of America, where you have Washington, New York, etc. In one coach there sat a very pretty young woman dressed in elegant taste and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler. Lot of detail told about this particular traveler, the young woman. They're not given the name, but that she's traveling on the B&M Express. She was a pretty young woman dressed in elegant taste, which means dressed in a lot of finery, rich clothing, and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler, which means that she's also someone who travels a lot, who travels very often. So her body language and her whole demeanor looks like that of an experienced traveler. When I use the word demeanor, it essentially means the way we conduct ourselves, our body language, the way we would react to a situation. That all means part of the body language and demeanor. Okay. Among the newcomers were 2 young men, one of handsome presence with a bold, frank countenance and manner, the other a ruffled, glum-faced person, heavily built and roughly dressed. The 2 were handcuffed together. Now, we also know about the other 2 persons, Mr. Easton and Marshall. Now, one of them was of a handsome presence, looked very good, with a bold, frank countenance. Countenance again is the manner in which you look and manner. And the other a ruffled, glum-faced person, heavily built and roughly dressed. As they passed down the aisle of the coach, they were handcuffed together. The only vacant seat offered was a reversed one facing the attractive young woman. Now here the linked couple. Why is the phrase linked couple used? Because they are linked with the handcuff. Here the linked couple seated themselves. So there is Miss Fairchild sitting here, and opposite me are the linked couple the two people, one of them who is looking very good, who is very handsome looking, and the other person who is of a rough countenance. The young woman's glance fell upon them with a distant, swift disinterest. She was not interested. She just looked at them, didn't probably even register who they are. She was not interested. With a swift, distant disinterest. Then with a lovely smile brightening her countenance, the second time the word countenance has been used, and a tender pink tinging her rounded cheek, she held out a little grey gloved hand. Now, in those times in America or anywhere in the West, the privileged women used to wear a glove because they wouldn't want their hand to be touching the skin of any other person. So there was this classism that was prevalent, especially among the rich classes, and this woman obviously belonged to one of those privileged classes, as has already been explained in the first paragraph. Now, so first of all, her first reaction was that of a distant, swift disinterest, but then suddenly she recognized one of them, and her expression changed, her facial expression changed, and it changed so much that she held out her grey gloved hand, and a tender pink tinging her rounded cheeks, almost as though she was blushing. When she spoke, her voice, full, sweet and deliberate, proclaimed that the owner was accustomed to speak and be heard. To speak and be heard is almost being vain, that when you speak, you expect that the people around you would listen to every word that you are speaking. So it also conveys a sense of vanity. Well, Mr. Easton, if you will make me speak first, I suppose I must. Don't you ever recognize old friends when you meet them in the West? Right? So she's calling out to Mr. Easton and she says, well, let me speak first, and don't you ever recognize old friends? So there is a tinge of sarcasm that don't you recognize old friends when you meet them in the West? They are in the West part of America traveling towards the East Coast on the BM Express. So she asked sarcastically, Mr. Easton, don't you recognize old friends? The younger man roused himself sharply at the sound of her voice because he has not quite registered her. Seemed to struggle with a slight embarrassment which he threw off instantly, and then clasped her fingers with his left hand. With his left hand, he held her grey gloved hand that she had extended towards him. It's Miss Fairchild, because he finally recognizes her. Initially, he has not registered her. It's Miss Fairchild, he said with a smile. I will ask you to excuse the other hand. It's otherwise engaged at this moment, just at present. So he is holding out the left hand, which is unusual because you are expected to extend the right hand in a handshake. So he says, you must excuse that I am extending my left hand to you for a handshake because my right hand is engaged at the moment. He slightly raised his right hand, bound at the wrist by this shining bracelet. So the handcuff is in a slightly sarcastic manner referred to O. Henry as a bracelet, as a shining bracelet, to the left one of his companion. So the right one of Easton is tied with the handcuff to the left hand of his companion. The glad look in the girl's eyes suddenly changed into a bewildered horror. Bewildered means a sense of confusion, a sense of fear, as the word horror would convey. So it's a confused fear with which Miss Fairchild reacts. She has not seen the handcuff till then. So when she sees the handcuff, which Easton raises to show it to Miss Fairchild, she reacts with confused fear. The glow faded from her cheeks. That pink tinge which was there on her cheeks suddenly faded. Her lips parted in a vague, relaxing distress. Easton, with a little laugh as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled him. The glum-faced man had been watching the girl's countenance with veiled glances from his keen, shrewd eyes. Now the other person, Marshall, is described because the glow faded from her cheeks. Her lips parted in a vague, relaxing distress. Easton, with a little laugh, as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled him. So he was about to give more details, but Marshall at this point in time stops Mr. Easton. He kind of makes a gesture which makes Easton stop. And Marshall, who is the glum-faced man, the rough man, as described in the first paragraph, is the person who has been looking at this exchange of words taking place between Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton with his keen, shrewd eyes. Keen, shrewd eyes. Remember all this different phrases, adjectives which are being used to describe the three people. We have had Miss Fairchild being described initially as a pretty young woman, dressed in elegant taste and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler. You have who held out her grey gloved hand, and now you have the marshal being described as someone with keen, shrewd eyes. You'll excuse me for speaking, miss, but I see you are acquainted with the marshal here. So the marshal described Mr. Easton as a marshal. But I see that you are acquainted with the marshal here. If you will ask him to speak a word for me when we get to the pen, he will do it. Pen refers to prison. He is taking me to Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting. So now we get the detail that this person is being taken by Mr. Easton, presumably the marshal, at least that's what this person tells, that he is being taken to Leavenworth prison because he has been convicted 7 years to prison, to Leavenworth prison, for counterfeiting, for the crime of counterfeiting. So he is wanting Miss Fairchild, who he realizes knows Mr. Easton, to put in a word for him. Okay. Oh, said the girl with a deep breath and returning color. So now the color has returned to Miss Fairchild's cheeks. So what is it that you are doing out here? You are a marshal, Mr. Easton. So she's referring to Mr. Easton, who she knows, and he says, oh, so you are the marshal and you're carrying this person who has to be deposited at Leavenworth prison. My dear Miss Fairchild, said Easton calmly, I had to do something. Money has a way of taking wings unto itself, and you know it takes money to keep step with a crowd in Washington. So she now wants to know what does he do as an occupation, and she realized that he is a marshal. So he says that yes, I had to do something. Money has a way of taking wings unto itself, and you know it takes money to keep step with a crowd in Washington. I would want you to keep a note of this because we'll come to analyze this at the end of the story, because you will understand it much better then. I saw this opening in the West, and well, a marshalship isn't quite high a position as that of the ambassador, but we will explain this particular paragraph at the end of the story. The ambassador, said the girl warmly, does not call anymore. What does we understand is that probably at one point in time, Miss Fairchild and Mr. Easton were romantically inclined towards each other. At that time, there was someone called the ambassador also in the picture, and Mr. Easton perhaps thought that she was romantically inclined towards the ambassador, which is why he is making a slightly sarcastic remark, sarcastic comment, a sarcastic reference to the ambassador, saying that the marshal is not as high a position as that of an ambassador, but, and he just tapers off, he doesn't finish the sentence because Mr. Fairchild interjects. She says, Mr. Ambassador does not call anymore. That means that she is no longer with the ambassador as a couple. He need not ever have done so. You ought to know that. And so you are one of those dashing Western heroes, and you ride and shoot and go into all kinds of dangers. So she is very fascinated by this profession of marshal that Mr. Easton seems to be following. That she says that, you know, you are there in all sorts of dangers and you ride and shoot. That's different from the Washington life. You have been missed from the old crowd. So she also says now the word missed, that she missed him in that old crowd. They were part of some kind of a high society, and Mr. Easton is no longer there. The girl's eyes, fascinated, went back, widening a little to rest upon the glittering handcuffs. But her eyes come back to that shining bracelet, the handcuffs, and her eyes rest there. Don't you worry about them, miss, said the other man. All marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them away from getting away. Mr. Easton knows his business. So now the marshal speaks and says that don't you worry, because he realizes that her eyes are resting on the handcuff, and says don't you worry, he has attached them to me so that, you know, I don't escape. Will we ever see you again in Washington? Asked the girl. Not soon, I think, said Easton. My butterfly days are over. Now, what is a butterfly days? Butterfly days is a reference to, you know, being a social butterfly, moving around in high society, and he says, my butterfly days are over. This part also we will explain at the end of the story. I love the West, said the girl irrelevantly. Her eyes were shining softly. She looked away out the car window. She began to speak truly and simply, without the gloss of style and manner. Mama and I spent the summer in Denver. She went home a week ago because father was slightly ill. I could live and be happy in the West. I think the air here agrees with me. Money isn't everything, but people always misunderstand things and remain stupid. This paragraph is extremely important because it gives you a sense, it gives you an understanding of what kind of a person Miss Fairchild is. Because she says, I love the West because the air suits me. At the same time, she says, my mother had to go back to look after my father who had fallen sick, which shows that she's probably not such a very sensitive daughter because she does not see the need to go back and also look after her father. So it shows a slightly insensitive manner, a insensitive aspect of Miss Fairchild. She says, I could live and be happy in the West. She seems to be very, very self-centered and thinking only about herself. And she says, I think the air agrees with me more here in the western part of America. And then she says, money isn't everything. But people always misunderstand things and remain stupid. This is most ironic because it is finally, as we will realize at the end of the story, it is Miss Fairchild who is actually being the most stupid of the lot because she is the one who is not able to understand what things are. She is going by the literal optics of believing what she is seeing without actually realizing that what you see may not always be true. So she says money isn't everything, but people always misunderstand things and remain stupid. And this is really the most ironic line in this entire story, because as you will realize at the end of the story, it is Miss Fairchild who's actually the most stupid because she's the one who is misunderstanding. She's the one who is seeing things and believing what she's seeing is actually true without realizing that what she's seeing is actually not the real story. Say, Mr. Marshall, growled the glum-faced man. This isn't quite fair. I'm needing a drink and haven't had a smoke all day. Haven't you talked long enough? Take me into the smoker now, won't you? I'm half dead for a pipe. So Marshall tells Mr. Easton. Miss Fairchild believes that he's the Marshall. So, this person is a convicted guy who has to be sent to Leavenworth prison. So this person tells Easton that you have spoken long enough. Let me go into the smoker's cabin on the train and on the B&M Express and let me have a smoke. The bound travelers rose to their feet because obviously he does not want this conversation to prolong too long. Easton with the same slow smile on his face. I can't deny a petition for tobacco, he said lightly. Easton. What does it say? That Easton is also equally shrewd because he plays along very smartly. It's the one friend of the unfortunate, that is tobacco. Goodbye, Miss Fairchild, duty calls, you know. He held out his hand for a farewell, which would be the left hand. It is too bad you are not going east, she said, reclothing herself with manner and style, which means that she's delivering these lines with a lot of elan and style. That, you know, it's too bad that you're not going east, but you must go on to Leavenworth, I suppose. Yes, said Easton, I must go on to Leavenworth. The two men sidled down the aisle into the smoker. The two passengers in a seat nearby had heard most of the conversation. Said one of them, that Marshall is a good sort of chap. And they're referring to who? That person is referring to Easton. That Marshall is a good sort of chap. Some of these Western fellows are all right. Pretty young to hold. The first person, he's understood who the Marshal is. Pretty young to hold an office like that, isn't he? Asked the other. Young? Exclaimed the first speaker. Why? Didn't you catch on? Did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand? And that is the twist, because only that first of these two passengers has actually realized that it is not Mr. Easton who is the Marshal. It is this person who is the real Marshal, even though he looks of a more rough kind of an exterior. Why? Because he has realized and he knows the rules that you do not. Did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand? You always handcuff a prisoner to his left hand, whereas Mr. Easton's right hand was handcuffed to the left hand of the Marshal. So it is the Marshal who is the real Marshal and not Mr. Easton, as the second passenger or Miss Fairchild had assumed. So he is the only one who has actually caught on who is the real Marshal of the story. And now we come to those two paragraphs which I said we will look at. The first one where Mr. Easton says money has a way of taking wings onto itself, and you know it takes money to keep step with a crowd in Washington. And then you connect it with the fact that he has spoken about it is 7 years for counterfeiting. So it is Mr. Easton who has done some financial fraud, as a result of which he has been convicted to Leavenworth prison for 7 years for the crime of counterfeit. Because, and this is where he gives it away, where he says money as a way of taking wings, and it takes money to keep step with the crowd, because he has tried to be smart with money, making money the wrong way in order to keep step with this hi-fi society in Washington. The second part, which I said will come at the end of the story, is about money isn't everything. People always misunderstand things and remain stupid, which is a comment on Miss Fairchild itself. My butterfly days are over, I fear. Butterfly days, as I referred, is a reference to the social butterfly, that you move around with the society, the high society crowd. And he says, my butterfly days are over, I fear, because he's going to be inside jail for the next 7 years. So obviously that's yet another giveaway where he says that my butterfly days are over. So that's the story, Hearts and Hands, and we'll just go through the analysis of this particular story, because this is essentially a story which focuses on society's emphasis on appearances. Miss Fairchild goes essentially by the appearance of these two gentlemen. Similarly, even the second passenger has gone by the appearance of these two people and not really by the nuances of to which hand the handcuff is actually put to keep the prisoner to himself and ensure that he does not escape. So even though Easton is a convicted for 7 years to prison, he successfully puts on the air of a marshal so as not to embarrass himself in front of Miss Fairchild. And it is the marshal who, though he looks of a ruffled and glum-faced person, he is the one who is much more kind-hearted, because he does not want to embarrass Mr. Easton in front of Miss Fairchild. So he is willing to be seen as the convict in front of Miss Fairchild and let Mr. Easton be thought of someone who is an honorable person in the society in the US, especially in Washington. The interaction shows how much their social circle cares about keeping up appearances, and how deceptive those appearances can be, since they fail to indicate anything, especially something as criminality, something like the crime of counterfeit. Now, irony is a very useful device which is used in this particular story. I referred to one of them about Miss Fairchild in particular. The second one, of course, is also when Easton says, my butterfly days are over, I fear. It is not because of the shortage of money, as Miss Fairchild possibly assumes that, you need money to keep up appearances in Washington, but because he's going to prison and he's not going to be out for 7 years. So for 7 years, his butterfly days are over. Also, when Marshall says that he's taking me to Leavenworth prison, it is 7 years for counterfeiting. Fairchild automatically assumes that it is the disheveled person that is being spoken of, because he is the one who is speaking it, while emphasis on appearances, which is deceptive, whereas it is Mr. Easton who looks much more of a smooth and a good looking and a handsome person who's actually being sent to prison. The other one, which I also referred to now, I had to do something. Money has a way of taking things to itself. Here Fairchild assumes that Easton had to become a marshal to make ends meet, while the real reference is actually to his career as a criminal. She assumes that money has a way of taking things itself, that he had to work hard to keep up the appearances in the high society of Washington, while he's actually talking about the crime that he had committed in the world of counterfeiting. So the greed for money has really got him into trouble. The significance of the title, hands, of course, very, very obvious. We are talking about the hands of the Easton and the marshal, which are tied together as a result of the handcuff. The hearts refers to the hearts of all the three protagonists. I will come to the heart of Marshall, because he is the one who is more kind-hearted in this particular case as opposed to the other two. He is the one who has a more compassionate heart, even though his appearance would convey the impression that he is much more of a rough kind of a person. He does not want his person who he is taking to Leavenworth prison to be embarrassed in front of an old acquaintance or an old friend. The second heart reference is, of course, to Miss Fairchild, whose heart seems to harbor some kind of love and affection for Mr. Easton. She's flirtatious to an extent, asking Easton if he does not recognize an old friend, and also calling him one of those dashing Western heroes. Easton's heart. Now, Easton is the one who has his heart in the wrong place. Obviously, that's why he has committed a crime for which he has been sentenced to 7 years inside Leavenworth prison. And even though he has been convicted, he continues to conveniently lie even at this point in time. That seems to come rather naturally to him. He has been a cheat, which is why he's been convicted, but he has no qualms about lying yet again when he's on his way to Leavenworth prison. The hands we have already discussed. The Fairchild comes across as someone who is gullible, who is not able to see through appearances. Of course, she's also very pretty and fair-skinned, has a pink glow on her cheeks, and has all the ways of a luxurious and an experienced traveler. Whereas Easton comes across someone who is an opportunist. Please write down these words. He's an opportunist who does not shy away from lying. Once the marshal gives him an opportunity and is quick on his feet, he's smart, and he's able to catch on that the marshal has actually given him a window of opportunity to lie and to ensure that Miss Fairchild thinks of him as an honorable man who is taking this person to Leavenworth prison. And even when Marshall speaks about smoking as a way to get out of this conversation, he's again very quick on his feet to understand that it is a ploy to get out, and he says, I can't deny a petition for tobacco. It is the one friend of the unfortunate duty call. So he plays along and he's pretty comfortable impersonating. Please write down this phrase. He's very comfortable impersonating as a marshal even on his way to Leavenworth prison. The two of them are spoken of as a linked couple, but despite being a linked couple, and this is the interesting aspect of the story by O. Henry, despite being a linked couple, the Marshal and Easton are actually very different from each other in various aspects. One of them is a clear fraud, which is why he's being sentenced to prison. The other one is doing his duty as a marshal. This person is an opportunist. This person is more kind-hearted. He's actually, the marshal gives him an opportunity so that he's not embarrassed in front of his old acquaintance. So in that sense, it's about appearances, it's about irony, it's about pretense. It's also about vanity of Miss Fairchild, about the manner in which she holds out with her grey glove, in the manner in which she assumes that she must be heard and she is the one who should be speaking out. And the marshal lends him a helping hand. You know, apart from the word the hands in reference of the handcuffs, it's also about Marshal lending Mr. Easton a helping hand in order to save his honor in the crowded compartment in front of an old friend. So hand actually in this case holds the key to a person's real identity. You know, the hand, the literal sense, the optics of the hands being handcuffed, but in that sense of, in the sense of him lending a helping hand so that he is not embarrassed, not just in front of Miss Fairchild, but also in front of the entire crowded compartment. So that's the analysis of this story, Hearts and Hands by O. Henry. Do write in the comment section if there is any aspect that you would want more clarity on. We could do another video before the exams and also look at specific questions and answers. That is something which we will definitely do. Once you have understood the story very well, taken down the notes, and please make it a point to use the many of the phrases that I have used so that your answers actually end up looking better, better language. They look more well-rounded answers so that the examiner gets impressed with the thoroughness with which you have actually understood and appreciated this story. So do subscribe to the YouTube channel Study with Sudhir and also press on the bell icon so that you will get regular updates on all the videos that we will be putting out on all the chapters that are part of the ICSE English board and also on other subjects like history and civics. Thank you very much for watching.